This screencast is on the short-run aggregate supply curve, the shape of the short-run aggregate supply curve, and the different models that correspond along with it, and then the long-run aggregate supply curve, the shape of it, and how the two interact with one another. When we talk about aggregate supply, remember that aggregate means total. So aggregate supply is the total quantity of final goods and services that producers are willing and able to supply at the given price levels. Remember, when we're talking about aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we're not using pricing, quantity, and supply and demand. Instead, you've got the AS and AD, and then you've also got the real GDP and price level. And when you look at equilibrium, it is denoted with a Y. The F here stands for full employment, and as we go through, we'll start to talk about that more and more. The shape of the aggregate supply curve is a positive relationship between the price level and real GDP. It's upward sloping because the idea is that production costs are fixed in the short run. You can't really change those. And so producers would be willing and able to supply more if the price was going up because they'd be making a greater profit. But we have a differentiation really in the short run aggregate supply curve when we talk about the classical versus the Keynesian model. So the classical model is the one that originates in the 1800s by John Baptiste Say. And he's known for Say's law, and Say is S-A-Y. He's known for Say's law, which says that supply creates its own demand. Classical model is really about the laissez-faire, government, hands-off, they're not involved in things, and that over time, the prices and the wages would work themselves out and they would be able to come to that full employment equilibrium. You just had to let them be flexible and move, and then they would eventually work their way to this equilibrium point, either lowering if they were too high or rising if they were too low. He also believed that savings was a function of the interest rate, and that people would save more if the interest rate was higher, but that businesses had this inverse relationship between the interest rate and savings. And so with the classical model, people really believed in this flexible prices and flexible wages really up until the Great Depression. And then in 1930, John Maynard Keynes came out with Keynesian economics, where he was talking more about aggregate demand and how that's what needed to be influenced in order to get to that full employment. Because remember, Say was about the flexible wages and the flexible prices of the aggregate supply, getting it to the equilibrium, and Keynes is about shifting the aggregate demand curve to get it to the full employment level. Say's said supply creates its own demand. Keynes said demand creates its own supply. And he felt that in order for demand to get to where it needed to be, that the government needed to be involved. So when we talk about fiscal policy, that's Keynesian economics. Keynes didn't believe that there were flexible prices and wages. Instead, he believed that wages and prices were what are called sticky, meaning that they stay constant in the short run and they don't really budge. And the reason that he said that nominal wages, which nominal number, the wages is what people are getting paid, the reason that he said that they don't really change in the short run is because they're negotiated ahead of time, and this is what businesses are doing, and businesses aren't going to respond right away to a change in wages if things are happening in the market. And so if there is high unemployment, you're not going to see wages really fall in order to give businesses more money. Likewise, if times are going well, you're not going to see an increase in the wages to adjust to that also. And so when we look here at this Keynesian model, in this short run, his is this horizontal curve as opposed to the upward sloping that was being shown in the classical model. Another difference between the classical model, which again had the flexible wages and the prices, and also was about Say's law that said that supply creates its own demand, was that Keynesian said not only were there these sticky wages and prices, and that demand creates its supply, but he felt that savings and consumption were a function of disposable income. So when you think about one of the formulas that we have, where disposable income, you either save it or you spend it, that's how Keynes was looking at things. Whereas remember with Say, he was about how the interest rate, an increase in the interest rate affected people's savings. And so that was another difference that you see between them. And so what you have here is you have this short run where you have these sticky wages and the sticky prices that aren't really going to move or be flexible. But then how is it then that they can meet up to this full employment level? And that's where you do have this short period of time where you have this upward sloping part of the short run aggregate supply. And that is where then you are meeting it to the long run. So in the Keynesian model, you really would only see the red, the blue, and then the yellow up above, and it's shown as a dotted line. But what we're going to do in class is that we're going to combine both the Keynesian and the classical model. So you are expected to have your downward sloping aggregate demand curve, and then for your short run aggregate supply, you will show the sticky prices and the wages of the Keynesian model. They will curve up to show the intermediate, and then you will just continue along with the short run aggregate supply curve. And where you have this intersection here of the short run aggregate supply and the aggregate demand, you will draw a vertical long run aggregate supply curve. And then that will show the different phases that go along with it.